Welcome, everyone, to the third of this year's Terry Lectures. My name is Harold Attridge. I'm a professor of New Testament at the Divinity School and a member of the Terry Lectures Committee. Before I introduce our lecturer today, let me remind you and myself to turn off your cell phones and other beeping, chirping devices. Let me also remind you that there'll be a reception after today's lecture in the area upstairs where the reception was held after the first of the Terry Lectures. Please do join us there to celebrate what I think has been a wonderful series. As you all no doubt know by now, Professor Wendy Doniger is the Mircea Eliade Distinguished Service Professor of the History of Religions in the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. My colleagues Dale Martin and Noreen Kawaja, who previously introduced her, have told you of Professor Doniger's distinguished academic career, her impressive record of publication, and her services to the field of religious studies. It is indeed an honor to welcome her here for this series of lectures. We have heard in the previous two lectures what makes Professor Doniger's publication so appealing. Her magisterial command of the classic sources of the Hindu tradition, to be sure, but also her deft analysis of the ways in which elements of that tradition interact. We learn, to begin with, of the distinction of the three spheres: Dharma, the realm of religion and morality; Artha, the realm of power; and Kama, the realm of pleasure. We've also learned of the technical, scientific literature devoted to each of these realms: Manu's Dhamma Shastra, Kautilya's Arthra Shastra, and Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra. In the last lecture, Professor Doniger paid special attention to the ways in which both Kautilya and Vatsyayana, but especially the latter's Kama Sutra, paid lip service to the dharmic order espoused by Manu, while at the same time boldly subverting it. What we have heard so far has been a rich tour de force, exploring the sciences of ancient India and the ways in which the systematic exploration of power and pleasure stands in creative tension with the social and conceptual world of religious and moral order. Through all of this, we've seen not only the interaction of science and religion in ancient India, but also the ways in which the modern sciences of philology and cultural analysis have illuminated one of the world's great religious traditions. We look forward to today's final lecture in this year's series. Professor Doniger will explore how widespread was skepticism in ancient India. But before she does, I have two pictures to show you. One is a picture that you're all familiar with, I think, from her book on the Hindus, with its marvelous and very evocative picture of a horse that's also a series of beautiful women. This is a marvelous cover shot, but there's another cover shot from Professor Doniger's past, which you need to be aware of. From the Pulpit Digest, and the woman on that cover, the cover girl, is Professor Doniger. And at the bottom is a quote from the Song of Solomon, the Song of Songs. "For lo, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth, the time of the singing of birds has come." An interesting juxtaposition of sacred scripture and love poetry, which is an appropriate way of thinking about what's happening in some of these lectures. I give you Professor Wendy Doniger.
Thank you, Harry. And thank you all for coming back for the third lecture. That was a wonderful summary, better than I could really do. And I'm going to go in a different direction today, a little more uncertain for me, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards, because this is very much a work in process. In the first lecture, I argued that the Kama Sutra, the textbook of the erotic science, was closely based upon the Artha Shastra, textbook of political science, and that both of them often deviated significantly from the textbooks of Dharma. In the second lecture, I argued that these deviations amounted to a covert attack on Dharma. Now I want to argue that this attack was continued in a most ingenious and devious way by the creation of a mythology about wicked people called Lokayatas. And here I want you to look at the second side of the handout sheet, which will have these names of these different schools of skepticism, which get very complicated. So these wicked people called the Lokayatas, which really literally means worldly. Loka is the world, like locus in Latin actually, but they're also skeptics. Sometimes they're called Charvakas, and that literally means sweet talkers, but it comes to mean hedonists. And these people are also sometimes said to be called Charvaka because they are the followers of the teachings of a philosopher named Charvaka, for whom there is no evidence of his existence ever. And finally, sometimes they are said to be called Badhaspatyas, from an alleged lost text called the Sutra of Brihaspati, attributed to Brihaspati, the mythical Machiavellian chief minister of the king of the gods, who doesn't even claim to be a real person. He's supposed to be up in heaven giving bad advice to the king of the gods. So already there's this mythical element in where these ideas come from. The words of these Charvakas were always cited with shock and disapproval, but always cited, always kept alive in the Hindu tradition. Like a driver with one foot on the brakes and another on the accelerator, certain Indian texts ricochet between the praise of Dharma and the need to undermine Dharma. The straw man citations of Charvakas reveal numerous instances of resistance to the Dharmic party line. A philosopher in the 14th century regarded both the Arthashastra and the Kama Sutra as part of the Charvaka tradition. He wrote, "Most people, in accordance with the Arthashastra and Kama Sutra, considering Artha and Kama the only human aims of the three human aims, in other words, not considering Dharma, and denying the existence of any object belonging to a future world, are found to follow only the doctrine of Charvaka, also called Lokayata." So now he's putting the two of them together as synonyms, whereas you'll see they're a little different. And he continues and ends, "And since most people live by this doctrine, it's hard to wipe out." For the dominant tradition attributes to Charvakas criticism of Brahmins and of Dharma, and we've seen that this criticism is largely valid for what the Arthashastra and the Kama Sutra actually advocate, though it is not what they say they advocate. So this 14th century philosopher had their number. Who were these proponents of undharma? At the very start of the Arthashastra, right after the table of contents, Kautilya endorses the views of the Lokayatas, who, he says, apply logic to the Vedas, the most ancient and sacred texts of Hinduism, in order to distinguish Dharma from undharma. And these are people he approves of. He tells the king he should learn from these people, these Lokayatas. Then Kautilya rejects the views of people he calls the Badhaspatyas, the inheritors of this mythical Brihaspati, who argue that the Veda, quote, is merely a cloak for a person conversant with how the world operates. So he calls them hypocrites. Here, in the opening frame of the book, still in his pro-Dharma mood, remember we saw he's pro-Dharma at the beginning and at the end, Kautilya approves of the pro-Vedic Lokayatas and strongly disagrees with the anti-Vedic Barhaspatya. So he distinguishes them, and he's on the side of the angels. The Lokayatas, therefore, in the Arthashastra are not a sect, but a philosophical approach. In recommending the Lokayatas and denouncing the Barhaspatyas, the Arthashastra makes a clear distinction between skeptics that he approves of and materialists that he does not approve of. This distinction will be confusingly blurred from now on. Many later Sanskrit texts describe Charvakas rather than Lokayatas as logicians and rationalists, philosophers who question the validity of any forms of knowledge. So this is the skeptical rather than the materialist tradition. The word usually translated as logician, hetuka, literally one who argues from causes, hetu, has much of the tone of English words like casuist, sophist, or even Jesuitical, designating someone who uses cold reason and plays tricks with words to deny the truths of the heart or the truths of religion. The distinction between skeptics and materialists is blurred in the Kama Sutra, which is highly critical of the people it calls Lokayatas, but represents not as skeptics but as materialists people who attack Dharma. So this is what Vatsyayana says that the materialists, the Lokayatas, say. He's quoting them. People should not perform acts of Dharma, for their results are in the world to come, and that is doubtful. Who but a fool would take what is in his own hand and put it in someone else's hand? Better a pigeon today than a peacock tomorrow, and better a copper coin that is certain than a gold coin that is doubtful. So this is what we learn to call the Purva Paksha, the opponent's wrong argument that begins the argument, and then you give your own right argument. So Vatsyayana is saying these are bad people. They say this wrong thing, which I just quoted to you. So these people are wrong to doubt the existence of a future heaven, an argument that Vatsyayana blows out of the water coming to the defense of Dharma. The Kama Sutra lists Lokayatas along with fatalists and pragmatists. Again, not philosophical schools, but types of persons, people who believe in only what they can see and live for today, as we might speak of a person as a Stoic or Epicurean, not someone who follows the Roman philosophies, but just someone who enjoys a good bottle of wine. By about the 8th century, however, the terms Lokayata and Barhaspatya came to be used interchangeably with the term Charvaka to signify materialism rather than skepticism. And eventually Charvaka took the place of Lokayata as the word most often used for materialist. According to a 12th century historian, the Barhaspatyas, Charvakas, and Lokayatas are usually regarded as a single school. If that was not complicated enough, there is also another term, a more general and commonly used term that is often applied to or confused with Charvakas, and that term is Gnostica, which is also on your handout. Indian commentators generally regarded the primary meaning of Gnostica as atheist, that is, someone who denies the existence of the gods. The term Gnostica is traditionally and probably historically derived from the phrase na asti. A Gnostica is thus one who says it is not, na asti. It's like est in Latin or French, or esti in Greek. It's an Indo-European word, and na is not. So na esti, nasti, people who say it isn't. So a Gnostica is literally a naysayer, and it's in contrast with an astika, which is someone who says it is, asti, which is a pious Hindu. So the Gnostics are people who say no, and the good Hindus are the ones who say it is. But that to which the Gnostica says nay was regarded quite differently as different times. What is it that is not? The subject of the copula is omitted, which has left the more precise meaning of the term open to dispute. It or he may refer to a god, as in a phrase in the Rig Veda, which is the oldest Hindu sacred text, perhaps as old as 1500 BCE. And the line says, "They say of Indra," that's the king of the gods, "they say of him, he is not Nasti." So that's an old text which quotes some people as saying that this most important god in the Veda, most powerful god anyway, is not. In a passage in the Katha Upanishad a few centuries later, the unexpressed subject of Nasti could refer to the pantheistic universal world soul, the Brahman, Atman, which is the divine substance of which we're all made. And that phrase is, how can it be comprehended except by one saying, asti, it is. So you affirm the world soul with the same asti. As we've seen, the philosopher who identified the Arthashastra and Kama Sutra as Charvaka texts said that they deny the existence of any object belonging to a future world, which is another thing to deny. And one dictionary says that Gnostics deny that there is any other world or any Lord, putting both the God and heaven in doubt. So the picture I'm painting is of a lot of loose slander rather than precise philosophical argumentation. People say this and that about these terms. Sir Richard Burton, this is not Elizabeth's Sir Richard Burton, but the man who said he translated the Arabian Nights. Sir Richard Burton's translation, which is really a retelling, of the story of the king and the vampire, one of the great medieval texts of India. When asked to define the term atheist, the vampire replies, that is Gnostica, "Of a truth it is most difficult to explain. The sages assign to it 3 or 4 several meanings. First, one who denies that the gods exist. Secondly, one who owns that the gods exist but denies that they busy themselves with human affairs. And thirdly, one who believes in the gods and in their providence, but also believes that they are easily to be set aside. Thus, the Vishnu Swamis of the world have invested the subject with some confusion. The simple, that is to say, the mass of mortality, have confounded that confusion by reproachfully applying the word atheist to those whose opinions differ materially from their own." So despite the Orientalist swipe at the Vishnu Swamis, this summary is far from inaccurate. There's another idea about the Gnostics, which is a hypothesis, but I think a good one. The Gnostica or atheist may have originally been an integral part of the agonistic struggle of the Vedic sacrifice. That is, in that early period, long before the time of the Arthashastra of the Kama Sutra, back in 1500 BCE and after that, the term Gnostica denoted one who confronted someone who says it is the Astika. So you have 2 teams in the sacrifice. The doubts expressed in the Rig Vedas, such as maybe Indra, it does not exist, may have been merely part of the verbal contest with the official reviler, who does not reject sacrifice as a matter of abstract doctrine, but merely rejects his opponent's sacrifice. In other words, the Gnostica may have been nothing but the Purvapaksha in a contest with the triumphant Astika. Someone in the sacrifice says these bad things, and then we win by saying the good things. Later, however, these complementary ritual roles gave way to mutually exclusive doctrines as precise terms denoting opposition within the sacrificial structure gave way to imprecise pejoratives directed against that very structure. The Gnostica saying there is no sacrifice, as we'll see. For in post-Vedic texts, another criterion brings the Gnostica much closer to the Lokayata. The Gnostica denies the authority of the Vedas and therefore of Brahmins, whose job it is to recite and teach the Vedas. The lawmaker Manu refers to Gnostics together with revilers of the Brahmins or the Vedas. He speaks of a king who disregards the moral boundaries, who is a Gnostica and plunders the property of Brahmins, 2 very different things. And he says that any twice-born man, that is to say any Brahmin, who relies on the teachings of logic should be excommunicated by virtuous people as a Gnostica and a reviler of the Veda. So then you get atheism, reviling Brahmins and the Vedas, and simply being a logician, all lumped together by the time of Manu. Indeed, here Manu throws in with Gnostics and anti-Brahmins a skill, logic, professed by skeptics. For some skeptics were thought to deny the authority of Vedas and Brahmins, causing them to be ranked besides Buddhists and Jains. The original Gnostica was rarely prosecuted, since he offended gods but not Brahmins, that is to say, the one who simply said the gods don't exist. You wouldn't lock somebody up for that in ancient India. In keeping with the distinction which we noted in the second lecture between blaspheming against the gods, which was just fine, or almost just fine, and blaspheming against Brahmins and the Veda, which was not fine. The issue is, as usual, not about believing in gods. Lots of Hindus didn't believe in gods, but of believing in piety, in the efficacy of religious rules and rites, in the Veda, in a word, in Dharma. And so the Gnostics who were accused of reviling the Veda, like the Charvakas accused of condemning the Vedas as a pious fraud, would be much more likely to be prosecuted. And here, this is part of a broader argument I want to make in the book about the origins of laws against blasphemy in India, where it comes from. One text exhorts the king to punish Gnostics and those who have fallen from caste, which is an entirely behavioristic social concern, someone who violates the rules of his caste. And we've seen a philosopher describe these doctrines as hard to wipe out, perhaps implying that someone had tried hard to do so with limited success, In other words, that there was resistance against these behavioral problems where there had not been resistance against the doctrinal problems. Orthopraxy and orthodoxy again. The term Gnostica came to target in a scattershot fashion, not unlike the gamut satirized by Richard Burton, anyone who followed any of a variety of different teachings of materialism, including Buddhists, Jains, and Charvakas, or people who were said to deny the Vedas and the Atman of the Upanishads. But the broad distinction between Astikas and Gnostikas corresponds in application, if not always in theory, to various attempts to distinguish pious Hindus from Charvakas, and some texts take pains to sort them out. The Charvakas are at first a kind of internal diaspora within Hinduism, in contrast with true outsiders like Buddhists and Jains. So some people said they're all bad guys, Charvakas, Buddhists, and Jains, and some people say, no, Charvakas are our bad guys, and Buddhists and Jains are their bad guys. The Charvaka in a satirical play speaks Sanskrit, rather than the dialect assigned to lower class characters, probably reflecting the fact that this tradition was not a heresy originating outside of the Brahmin fold, like Buddhism or Jainism, but an internal heresy. And so, like the more general undharmic texts we considered in the second lecture, including the Arthashastra and the Kama Sutra, the Charvakas are Brahmins writing against other Brahmins. But the Charvakas' enemies often confuse them with non-Brahmins, just as they confuse them with Gnostikas and confuse Gnostikas with Buddhists and Jains. Thus, one text says that Charvakas, Buddhists, Jains, Greeks, has a new one, and several sects that worship the Hindu god Shiva, this is obviously written by a worshiper of the Hindu god Vishnu, should not be allowed to enter a kingdom. So you're really including all sorts of people. My mother, who was a serious Stalinist to the day she died, used the word Trotskyite to designate anyone she disagreed with. And for years, I just thought it meant a bad person, and I never realized that there was a guy named Trotsky. So it's that kind of scattershot, using a term that once had a precise meaning, namely a type of communist that followed Trotsky. By these evasive criteria, then, it is often difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish the materialist from the atheist, more precisely, Charvakas from Gnostikas. I want to look at a brief gallop through the history of these texts that talk about Charvaka. So we already saw Arthashastra and Kama Sutra. I want to go back in time now to what I think is the earliest of these texts, which is the Ramayana, which is several hundred years before either the Arthashastra or the Kama Sutra. An early mockery of materialist views appears in the Ramayana, one of the two great ancient Sanskrit epics, big book composed from 200 BCE to 200 CE, before and after that even. When the sage Jabali urges Rama to ignore family obligations and live, Rama's the prince, the king of the Ramayana, urges Rama to ignore family obligations and live for pleasure alone, and offers this argument. So Jabali just walks into the courtroom someday and says, "Hi, Rama, listen to this. People here busy themselves with the rite for the ancestors, but just look at the waste of food. What really is a dead man going to eat? And if something one person eats here could fill the belly of someone else, one could simply offer the sacrificial offering for a traveler, and he would need no provisions for the road. It was only to secure themselves donations that cunning men, Brahmins, compose those books that tell us sacrifice, give alms, sanctify yourself, practice asceticism, renounce. Accept the idea once and for all that there exists no world to come." So that's what Jabali says to Rama. Then he walks out. Jabali may merely be acting as the devil's advocate to stir Rama into righteous indignation, which is precisely what happens in the next chapter. Rama says, "Oh, Jabali, you're so wrong. Dharma's really good. The Brahmins are really great." Or Jabali may mean it. In either case, Jabali is not identified as a Charvaka or Lakayata. Rama calls him a Nastika, and then says a Nastika is no different from a Buddhist. And in some editions of the Ramayana, Jabali expresses Buddhist ideas too. So first he narrows it down and then he opens it. Though Jabali concludes with a Gnostica line, there exists no world to come, the argument that he offers, accusing the Brahmins of being in it just for the money and mocking the idea of feeding ancestors who are not physically present, is more seriously undharmic than anything that most Gnostics are said to say. And this argument will be repeated for centuries when anyone wants to satirize, that is the argument, Jabali's argument, will be repeated for centuries when anyone wants to satirize Charvakas and Lokayatas. To my knowledge, this passage in the Ramayana, almost certainly earlier than the Kama Sutra, is the first instance of such an accusation and may be implicitly quoted in all the subsequent citations. You'll see echoes of that speech. On the other hand, the Ramayana regards Lokayatas, remember this guy was a Gnostica, the Ramayana regards Lokayatas as skeptics, as when Rama challenges his brother Bharata, saying, "I hope you do not associate with Brahmins who are Lokayatas, dear brother. Their only skill is in bringing misfortune. They are fools who think themselves wise. Although preeminent texts on Dharma are ready to hand, those ignorant fellows derive their ideas from logic alone and so propound utter nonsense." So in this period at least, Gnostics and Lokayatas were clearly distinguished, and Gnostics were much worse, really more like Charvakas. The Mahabharata, the other great Sanskrit epic, 300 BCE to 300 CE, took longer to make. These are very approximate dates. Uses the word Charvaka as the name of an ogre, a Rakshasa, who disguises himself as a Brahmin, wearing the garb of a religious mendicant, with the rosary and trident that worshippers of Shiva carry. Remember, we've already seen Shiva worshippers who are always in trouble in ancient India lumped together. So this is part of that tradition. This guy named Charvaka, this Rakshasa, this fiend, is a friend of the villain of the Mahabharata, and he chastises the king who is the hero of the Mahabharata for killing his king's kinsman, which the king has indeed done and already feels very bad about. And the Charvaka says that the Brahmins all think the king should kill himself. The Brahmins, furious, say they said nothing of the kind, and they kill Charvaka. No doctrinal issues arise, and the episode seems designed primarily, literally, to demonize the Charvakas, evidence that they were said to be a serious threat to human life, as well as occasionally indistinguishable from the more extreme forms of the worship of Shiva. Within the Mahabharata is the Bhagavad Gita, this famous philosophical tract. And Charvakas are indirectly demonized in a passage that is often overlooked in the Gita, a passage which argues that there are two sorts of people, godlike and demonic. And the demonic, though not called Charvakas, bear a suspicious resemblance to Charvakas. This is what the Bhagavad Gita says about demonic people. There is no purity in the demonic, no morality, no truth. They say, the universe has no reality, no firm basis, no Lord. That sounds like a Gnostica, right? It has not come into existence through mutual causation. Desire is its only cause. What else? Since they insist upon this doctrine, their souls are lost and their wits are feeble, and so they commit horrible actions in their wish to harm and destroy the universe. So now we slide from doctrine to more serious issues of behavior. Immersing themselves in insatiable desire, possessed by hypocrisy, pride, and madness, in their delusion they grasp at false conceptions, doctrinal, and undertake impure enterprises, behavior. They are afflicted by countless worries that end only at doomsday, for their only aim is to enjoy what they desire, since they are convinced that this is all there is. So that's the strictly materialist view. There's nothing here but this. Bound by the fetters of hope, by the hundreds, obsessed by desire and anger, they long to amass great wealth by whatever foul means, sounds like the Arthashastra, to satisfy their desires, sounds like the Kama Sutra. Quote, I got this today. I'll satisfy this whim. This is my money, and this will be mine soon. I killed that man. He was my enemy, and I'll kill the others too. I'm master here. I'm the one who enjoys this. I'm successful and powerful and happy. Sounds more and more like the Arthashastra. I'm rich and superior. Who else is there the likes of me? I'll sacrifice and I'll give to charities and I will have fun. This is what people say when they're deluded by ignorance. So he even sneaks in a little false dharma there too. I will do the sacrifices, but I'm after the money. So this is a really interesting part of the Gita, which is seldom discussed in the philosophical analyses of the Gita. What begins with a logical argument, very like those attributed to Laukiatas or to Charvaka skeptics, or just to common or garden variety Gnostikas, shifts into the horrible actions and impure enterprises advocated by Charvaka materialists, and finally degenerates into pure hedonism. And all of it gets you into an eternal hell from which there is never any way out. I want to talk a bit now about skepticism, real skepticism, philosophical skepticism. A 9th century satirical play entitled A Brouhaha About Doctrines, Agambadambara, satirizes, it's a great line, Agambadambara, satirizes Charvakas among several other groups, including Buddhists and Jains, but they're separate. So there's a chapter, there's one act in which the Buddhist behaves very badly, there's a Hindu text, and then there's another act in which the Charvaka acts very badly, that's Act 3. In the third act, the Charvaka puts forth undharmic, materialistic, and hedonistic ideas, but also ideas about inference. He begins by saying, I'm going to do away with God, set aside the world to come, and demolish the validity of the Vedas. Later he says, asceticism is just a variety of torture. Self-restraint is just a way to cheat yourself of pleasures, while sacrificial rituals seem to me just like children's games. He goes on to liken the idea of God to logical impossibilities, and then there are standard logical impossibilities in Indian logic. One is the son of a barren woman, another is a mirage, and another made of the horn of a hare, because hares don't have horns. And he also goes on to laugh at the idea that the Vedas are authoritative. So we're piling up now these different strands of abuse. But then, when his opponent says that inference proves the existence of God, the Charvaka demolishes the validity of inference as a skeptic would. He says, even if clever logicians infer something with great effort, other extremely competent logicians account for the same thing in another way, and therefore neither of them is right. He therefore appears to combine the characteristics of the materialist and the skeptic Charvakas. The third act begins with a complaint that a cruel king has been rounding up quasi-tantric Shaiva mendicants, right? These are the Shaiva, the worshippers of Shiva. They say, we drink booze, eat meat, have women. These are the bad guys. And the king has been rounding them up, beating them up, and expelling them for being outside Vedic religion, and he threatens to kill them or throw them in prison. If this is a reflection of actual historical policy for which there is scattered evidence, there's a long story there, it would mean that such tantric Shaiva groups, these wrong kinds of Shiva worshippers, were in fact actively prosecuted. And this play seems to assume that Charvakas, who are, as we've seen, occasionally lumped together with these extreme Shaivas, slipped into the reformers' net as well. So we're beginning to see people prosecuted for bad behavior, but still not necessarily for what they said. Charvakas are mocked in an 11th century satirical play called The Rise of the Moon of Enlightenment, which distinguishes the Charvaka from the Lokayata. As the act begins, a man named Great Illusion praises Gnostikas and honors Brihaspati for founding the Charvaka dynasty. Remember, he's one of the mythical authors. The Charvaka then enters and says, the three Vedas make no difference when it comes to reaching heaven. Look, if those who perform the sacrifice find their way to paradise, then plentiful fruit there ought to be after the fire has burned up the trees that made the logs that made the sacrificial fire. Moreover, if he holds that heaven is attained by the beast that's sacrificed, then why does the sacrificer not slaughter as well his own father? And if funeral rites brought contentment even to creatures quite dead, the oil might well sustain the flame of the lamp once it's quenched. So this is another argument about the ancestors, not that they're far distant, but that they're antecedent in time. And so forth. There's a lot of this. Much of this we recognize from Jabali's speech on the Ramayana. So we're beginning to get a repeated set of rote accusations. In the 14th century philosophical tract called The Anthology of All Philosophies, so this is now, I've been citing plays until now, this is now a treatise of philosophical prose. The exaggerated form in which the Charvaka doctrine is depicted places it in the company of other texts that present the potted form of the doctrine. But significantly, although this author, unlike the authors of the texts we've considered until now, actually quotes text from most of the other traditions that he discusses, he does not pretend to quote any Charvaka or Lokayata text, perhaps because there were no such texts. So once by one, he does Buddhists, he does Jains, he does all these different people who are wrong, and he does the Charvakas, but he really quotes texts we know from the Buddhists and the Jains. He doesn't quote any Charvaka text. He doesn't even say he's quoting a Charvaka text. Perhaps because there were no such texts. That's what I'm going to argue. But he attributes the following doctrine, which owes much to the play we've just considered, to the quasi-mythical Brihaspati. There is no heaven, no final liberation, nor any soul in another world, nor do the actions of the four classes produce any real effect. The sacrificial offering, the three Vedas, smearing oneself with ashes, those are very different things. The Vedas are the old religion, smearing yourself with ashes is contemporary renunciation. All of them were made as the livelihood of those destitute of knowledge and manliness. That's the Brahmins, right? But now we're saying a little more about the Brahmins. If a beast slain in the sacrificial rite will go to heaven, why does then the sacrificer not forthwith offer his own father? You're just repeating what the other texts have said. And the offerings to the ancestors, while life remains, that's all repeated, trust me. Then, while life remains, let a man live happily, let him feed on butter even though he runs in debt. When once the body becomes ashes, how can it ever return again? If he who departs from the body goes to another world, how is it that he comes not back again, restless for love of his kindred? Hence it is only as a means of livelihood that the Brahmins have established here all these ceremonies for the dead. The three authors of the Vedas were buffoons, knaves, and demons. That's strong language for ancient India. All the well-known formulas of the pundits and all the rites were invented by buffoons, and so were all the various kinds of presents to the priests. Now you're hitting the priests in their pocketbook, where it counts. Hence, in kindness to the mass of living beings, must we fly for refuge to the doctrine of Charvaka. So we have Gnostikas here, we have pure hedonism, but while the author insists that he's quoting the mythical Brihaspati or reproducing Charvaka doctrine, he merely paraphrases the doctrine according to the understanding of a learned 14th century philosopher. Now we come to there's lots of those. I love them, but that's enough for now. But we come now to a different kind of a text, a real philosophical text. We do have one text composed in the 8th or 9th century attributed to a Brahmin author who may have been the descendant of the Lokayatas mentioned in the Arthashastra. Jayarashi Bhatta's The Lion of the Disturbance of Basic Principles, it's a great title, also means the lion that devours all categories, composed in the 8th or 9th century, expresses skeptical ideas and is believed to be the only text of the Lokayata or Charvaka school which has come down to us, as well as the only Sanskrit text in which a full-fledged skepticism is propounded. So this is a real philosophical argument. But what's interesting is that Jayarashi regarded himself as a follower of Brihaspati. One can see that clearly in several passages in his work where he tries to show that there is no real difference of opinion between him and the mythical Brihaspati. Yet he never calls himself a Charvaka or Lokayata, and he was not an heir to the materialist philosophy propounded in the texts attributed to Brihaspati. Was he, despite his own declaimers, a Charvaka skeptic? And if so, was he the only one? It's a long Sanskrit text. Were there others whose texts were lost? Jayarashi's work represents the extreme skepticism of the Charvaka school, arguing that no school of philosophy can claim its view of reality as knowledge, including the Charvaka text itself. Some scholars argue that Jayarashi did not belong to the Charvaka school at all, as he denies even that you could depend upon, for evidence, what you see with your own eyes, a criterion that the texts attributed to Charvaka skeptics had accepted. So here we're getting into more detailed fights among different types of skeptics, but we have a long, preserved philosophical text which argues that you cannot really know anything, the extreme form of ancient Indian skepticism. Jayarashi poses interesting questions for the history of materialism and skepticism. If he is the sole survivor of a lost school of Charvaka skepticism, then what is the source of the blasphemous statements attributed to the Charvaka materialists, of which there is no trace in Jayarashi? He does not say sacrifice your father. He does not say give up, the Brahmins are in it for the money, any of that. He just says you can't know anything. Jayarashi's work has been called the sole surviving philosophical text of the Charvaka school that's mocked in the play The Rise of the Full Moon. But the materialist sentiments that we've seen the Charvaka express in that play are not those of the skeptic Jayarashi. I think we can sort out three stages in the transition from skepticism to materialism. First, the extreme logical skeptics argued that you cannot know anything for sure. These may have been the Lokayatas that the Arthashastra approved of, and they are the lineage in which Jayarashi wrote. Second, some skeptics argued that if you can't know anything, you can't know if they're gods, and therefore there's no point in sacrificing to them. The Hellenistic skeptics, by contrast, argue that since you can't know anything for sure, you can't be sure that there aren't gods, and you might as well sacrifice. This is a form of Pascal's wager, right? Why take a chance? So in this second stage, Charvaka skeptics, right, you can't know if there are any gods, and Charvaka materialists, and therefore don't sacrifice, combine and are confused with the much better known Gnostikas, who were rather miscellaneously defined. And finally, in the third stage of this possible historical development, people picked up on an already existing tradition of Brahman bashing and Veda denying, which we know from Buddhist texts as well as Hindu folk traditions, perhaps vernacular traditions, and put it into the Sanskrit texts under the cover of attributing it to the Charvakas. Are the fragments that we have remnants of real Charvaka texts or merely satires by non-Charvakas? There are two main possibilities. The first is that the Charvaka materialists existed and mainline Hindus destroyed all of their texts. There are no surviving materialist texts. And later, when the Charvakas had died out, other Hindus made up distorted versions of their ideas. Our understanding of the materialist philosophy is fragmentary, based largely on criticism of their ideas by other schools. It is not a living tradition. Though materialism in some form or other has been present in India in many periods, we do not find any systematic work on materialism nor any organized school of followers such as the other philosophical schools possess. But almost every work of the other school states for refutation the materialist views, and our knowledge of Indian materialism is based on these. The fact that the Mahabharata actually called one of the Charvakas an ogre in disguise suggests how much of a myth they were, though it should also be said that many Hindu texts called Buddhists and Jains demons, and we know that they did really exist. Some scholars have argued that there must be or might be an entire corpus of lost texts dating to the Mauryan period. That's when Kautilya was originally thought to have lived, but known only from fragmentary quotations. Some of these scholars go on to hypothesize that there was a collection of aphorisms attributed not to the divine chief minister Brihaspati, but to a real person named Purandara. We have no Purandara text. And at least 5 commentaries on this or some other basic text, of which extracts are found in the works of the opponents. Since most of the fragments are found in works dated to roughly the 8th and 12th centuries, the same period in which the satirical plays that we've considered were also composed, they add nothing of great significance to what we know from those works, unless one regards them as genuine fragments rather than paraphrases by unsympathetic outsiders. But there is no evidence for this. We do not have the texts that the Kama Sutra and Arthashastra cite as predecessors, but both the anthological nature of those two texts and their explicit statement of indebtedness to other texts is strong evidence that such texts once existed. No such anthologies or statements of indebtedness in other texts exist for the Charvakas, nor are they ever mentioned in royal decrees as Jains and Buddhists are. I think that's true. I'm not much of an epigrapher. I've never come across them, but I need to check this with people who've really read. There are a lot of epigraphical texts in India, but I've never stumbled on any, and I think there may be none. But I would not say that in print until I checked it. But I think it's so. The second possibility is that the Charvaka materialists never existed as a school, but two very different sorts of Brahmins made up the ideas attributed to them. These two different sorts of Brahmins. The first group would have been Brahmins who did not agree with the ideas attributed to the Charvakas, but may have cited them because they knew that people did think such thoughts, and they hoped that by citing them they might give them a chance to blow off steam and get it out of their system, to absorb the opposition, so that they would still remain within the bounds of Dharma instead of abandoning it entirely. Or they may have cited the Charvakas in order to do just what they said they were doing, to warn people to stay away from them or to discredit them. These Charvaka ideas, not Charvaka people, because there weren't any Charvaka people in this second hypothesis. But another group of Brahmins may have secretly agreed with the ideas attributed to the Charvakas and cited them in their Shastras to keep the fifth column alive and say under cover what they wanted to say, to be able to attack Dharma behind the so-called Charvakas as behind a duck blind. This last sort of negative quotation happens all the time, not just in India. Stephen Marcus, in his book The Other Victorians, A Study of Sexuality and Pornography in Mid-19th Century England, published in 1966, actually quoted, in the course of an academic discussion and with disapproval, a number of pornographic texts that could not otherwise have been published at that time. When I was 13 in the 50s, we all read the Marcus book surreptitiously, sneaking it off one of our parents' shelves. Indeed, sometimes this sort of negative citation happens inadvertently. The scholar Sandra Gilman has come under, and others, but he's the one I know, has come under a critical attack for citing at great length, and in order to condemn them, racist and anti-Semitic texts that, his critics argue, he actually keeps alive where they might otherwise have died out. Were the Indian scholars doing it advertently, like Marcus, I think, or inadvertently, like Gilman, or both, thinking that they were stopping the Charvakas by mocking them when they were actually keeping them going? No matter what their intentions, they kept the Charvaka tradition alive. The Charvaka materialists always functioned as nothing but a myth. Either they once existed and immediately became mythologized, or they were myth from the very start. No matter whether they were once there and their texts were lost, or the Ramayana and Kama Sutra and subsequent texts invented them, in any case, from then on, their ideas, or carefully selected bits of their ideas, were available for Brahmins to use. Amartya Sen, in his book The Argumentative Indian, argues that, quote, atheism and materialism continue to attract adherents and advocates over many centuries and were increasingly associated with the exposition of the intellectually combative Charvaka, end quote. Sen puts much store in the Charvakas as a strong line of skepticism. The bad news I have for him is that there was probably not a thriving group of Charvakas as he hopes, But the good news is that there was a thriving argument about probably non-existent Charvakas that kept alive for many centuries their ideas, or someone's ideas, deconstructing Dharma. Indeed, their ideas were far more widely diffused than those lost texts could ever have been, as they found their way into the core of popular Dharma texts like the Ramayana. Whether or not they once existed, the idea that there were Charvakas and that they said very naughty things remained extremely important throughout Indian history as a way to say those things, a way for people to get to know the Charvaka idea. In a very real sense, the Charvakas were the Purva Paksha for dissident Hindus throughout history. Antinomianism, the sort of thinking that eventually flowered in the Charvaka materialist citations, was probably always there, as there are always people who rebel against authority. Even the more extreme social views of the Charvaka school already began to appear somewhat tentatively in the Vedic texts. The Jaiminiya Brahmana, which is very old, maybe 900 BC, maybe 700 BCE, much older than the Ramayana at least, before the Ramayana or the Kama Sutra or any of those, tells the story of Yavakri, a lustful and vicious Brahmin who compelled the wives of other men to come to him and submit to him sexually, and then often killed them. This story was then repeated in the Mahabharata centuries later and became a well-known part of the tradition. Here is evidence that some people at a very early date hated Brahmins and fantasized violent action against them. This part of the Charvaka materialism, at least, is very old indeed. But the idea that there were particular people in a special philosophical school called Charvakas who said a particular set of naughty things, Brahmins are in it for the money, ceremony for the ancestors can't nourish them, and so forth, is a specific Indian myth that is first documented in the Ramayana. Perhaps there was a widespread saying about such things, breathed about by many a village rake, which was then eventually applied to the Charvakas, who had previously existed, if at all, only as a very dry, extreme epistemological school, an easy scapegoat for other sorts of blasphemy. The Charvakas and I just wanted to say that reminds you that the philosopher said that most people believed in it and that it was hard to wipe out. That Charvakas and Lokaitas were criticized, slandered, and ridiculed in philosophical literature and in poetry and drama is an indication of the great weight and potential worth of materialism in the Indian philosophical tradition. I want to conclude with a brief word about science. The Shastras themselves constitute science in the broadest sense, and in the sense, I think, behind the Terry lectures on science and religion. But some scholars have postulated more specific links with science more narrowly conceived as natural science, the tradition of experimentation and empiricism. The final lines of a recent book about the Charvakas blame them, or more precisely their demise, for India's failure to develop the positive sciences. He writes, "Clearly, and some would say unfortunately, the Charvaka school was snubbed. It's difficult to say what might have happened if it had become mainstream Indian thinking. It's entirely possible that Indian civilization would have degenerated into a pleasure-seeking, hedonistic world like ancient Rome and perished in its insatiate orgies. Or again, the no-nonsense attitudes toward what they regarded as priestly mumbo-jumbo and the crass materialism of the Charvakas might have saved Indian culture from the myriad superstitions that still plague it. More significantly, the Charvakas might have sown the seeds for the positive sciences which would have germinated in India rather than in 16th century Europe. Who can tell?" End quote. Amartya Sen, too, associates the Charvakas with science, but positively. He writes, "We can argue that the flowering of Indian science and mathematics that began in the Gupta period, led particularly by Aryabhata in the 5th century CE, Varahamihra in the 6th, and Brahmagupta in the 7th, benefited from the tradition of skepticism and questioning which had been flourishing in India at that time, end quote. But the real contribution of the Charvakas is not to astronomy or mathematics, but to the unquenchable tradition of speaking truth to power, sniping away at the dominant paradigm. Thank you.
We have time for some questions, and I'd ask you please to come to one of the mics and line up on either side, and I'll call on you once we have some people ready to ask. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
No.
Thank you.
Still not.
Here.
One moment.
Oh, it's recording. That's what it is.
Yeah, that's
It's
what-
recording, it's not broadcasting, so just talk loud.
No, it's on now.
Okay.
Thanks so much. You mentioned in the second hypothesis, the first hypothesis that treats the Charvakas as actually real and having had a body of literature, that then the literature would have had to have been destroyed. And of course, we know instances of iconoclasm or desecration or stealing an icon and installing it in your own temple. But are there instances of destroying books? Is that tradition there?
There are later traditions. When I developed this for the book, there's so much more to say. When you get into the Bhakti period, so I'm talking about Ramayana, Mahabharata, we're talking about really ancient India. Then we get into the medieval period with the plays. But another piece of the puzzle is the Bhakti period, in which you sometimes get fanatics. And fanatics of a really fundamentalist type, that is, people who really, really hate anyone who doesn't believe what they believe. And there are instances of kings destroying texts. And there's a wonderful story about Tulsi, whose text was regarded as, whose great Ramayana text was disapproved of by the Brahmins. And they put his text and another text underwater, and the one that floated to the surface was the real one, and so forth. So there are tests where the book itself undergoes an ordeal, and so forth. So in the Bhakti period, you do have the Tulsi story and other books being destroyed, and you also have the idea that when people said that they disapproved of the Veda, the king would kill them. So there are aspects, there are many different kinds of Hinduism. And the Bhakti Hinduism, particularly in South India, often took on, and where there were Jains who were killed, you begin to get several centuries of real prosecution of people who had the wrong idea, as opposed to the more general policy of Hinduism, especially in North India and before and after the Bhakti, the crowning periods of Bhakti, where you could say whatever you liked as long as you behaved yourself. So Bhakti is an exception. Bhakti is a time when kings generally, and there's a little bit of that in that play that I read to you, where the king is rounding up the Shaivas and expelling them and so forth. So there are some instances of books being destroyed, but mostly the transmission of text was oral. So it didn't do any good to destroy a text, because most people had it in their heads. The Indians are great memorizers of texts and so forth. So it didn't do that much good to destroy a text, really. It wasn't like Europe, where people had to read the text in order to know what it said. So there wasn't that much of it, therefore, because it wouldn't do that much good. But
Thank you.
Okay, and on this side, and please could you identify yourself when you ask a question, if you want to come up to this mic, please.
Seth Sanders.
Hi, Seth.
Hi, Wendy. So comparing this to the history of especially Jewish, but also Christian skepticism and heresiology, at least in Jewish traditions, certainly, there are both mythical and real heretics and skeptics, right? So there's a myth about the four who entered paradise that involves this Elisha ben Abuya character, who's probably more of a concept than a person.
But they're real guys too.
Yeah, and so my question is, are there any named Charvakas or named Charvaka works ever?
Well, Brihaspati is the main name. And he's actually the planet Jupiter, among other things. I should have mentioned that to you. An inauspicious planet, I should say, in Indian thinking. No, that's it. I mean, Jaya Rashi is said to be the one Charvaka, but he's a philosopher. He didn't go around Brahmin bashing. So no, no one is named, and I need to check out with better, Whitney Cox in particular, with better epigraphers, but I've never heard any, all the citations from Charvakas are always in text. I've never seen one cited from any royal decree of any kind. And there are lots of royal decrees saying that we're going to really get after these bad guys, and they never mention the Charvakas. It's just the philosophical, the literary texts which satirize the Charvakas. So I have not yet seen evidence that they exist. We may find the Gnostic Gospels, we may see. You never say never. Things may happen. We may find other texts, but I've never seen them yet. But
so maybe more like Elisha Ben Abuya than...
I think it's more like Elisha Ben Abuya. Yes.
Okay, please.
So, thank you again. I'm Pratima. I'm in Judaic Studies. My question is, and I'm sorry if it's not fully formed yet.
Well, the lecture wasn't fully formed either, so we'll leave it.
So you'd mentioned the one satirical play where the Charvaka character speaks in Sanskrit rather than Prakrit. And I think you made a couple other comments about how this might have originated as something within. It was a intra-Brahmin initiative.
It had to. The texts have to be Brahmin texts. Whether they picked it up, where they got it from, that's what I wonder.
And then by the end of the lecture, it seemed like, I mean, in the critiques of, in the fact that it critiqued Brahmins, and the fact that in later works it seems like it's used as a way to demonize Brahmins. Could you comment a little bit about how that change might have happened? Is it just an internal philosophical dispute that got out and came and bit them in the ass, or what happened?
It's a good idea. It's a very good question. I've argued elsewhere in that book that we saw a picture of in the beginning of the Hindus, that although Brahmins control the Sanskrit texts, and Brahmins are the people who learn Sanskrit, and most people didn't learn Sanskrit and all of that, since Sanskrit was never the language that people actually spoke to say things like pass the butter and can I cross the street here, every Brahmin who spoke Sanskrit and wrote in Sanskrit knew another language too. He had to talk to his wife, he had to talk to his cook, he had to talk to his barber. So the idea of a hermetically sealed, or hermeneutically sealed Sanskrit corpus, where just Brahmins are talking to Brahmins, is nonsense. There's a lot of stuff that gets into Sanskrit texts, which I think comes from women, comes from lower castes, comes from village people, that has some of it in the Jaiminiya Brahman. There's just a lot of folk tales that we know from Grimm's collections and so forth. So there's always an opening in the tight little Sanskrit elite world, an opening into the people. People have mothers. Their mothers don't speak Sanskrit. Brahmins have mothers. Even Brahmins have mothers. Right? And so my feeling is that the idea that these are not philosophical ideas. The Brahmins are in it for the money. Is not a philosophical school, right? It's the sort of thing that people say who hate priests. And so I'm just thinking that the source, therefore, was outside of the Brahmin world, but some Brahmins thought it too. Not all Brahmins were priests. And not all Brahmins approved of the Vedas. There's a lot of dissident thought. So I'm thinking that who knows where it came from, but it may have come from outside the Brahmin world, and then the Brahmin said, this is cool, let's put it in Sanskrit. Or it just may be you had some rebel Brahmins within the tradition who said, I don't buy it. I just think this is nonsense, and I'm going to say so. So that we just have to speculate, but there are all sorts of places it could have come from. What we do know is that it was there, and that it's in Sanskrit. Therefore, it was passed on, however thought of it. It was perpetuated by Brahmins, because they're the guys who wrote the text that we have. They wrote the 9th century play, the 11th century play. Now they're saying, look at this stupid, foolish guy, the Charvaka. But they're saying it. He says this, and he's saying the same thing that Javali said, and so forth and so on. So that's what my argument is. Wherever it came from, it's an internal fight, Brahmin versus Brahmin. It's not a Buddhist argument. And it's not an anti-Brahmin article. It's not a Marxist argument I'm making at all.
I guess what I'm asking is, did it then get co-opted by other groups and materially result in any kind of, actually materially affect the lives of the Brahmins?
I don't think any ideas in India ever had any material effect. They're just talking to themselves. There has never been a revolution. People write against caste constantly. From the time of the Upanishads, this is unfair, we mustn't treat these people like this, and nothing is done about caste until well into the modern period. But there's lots of people who thought it was awful and who said so in texts. So there's a lot of dissonant writing and thinking, but there are no revolutions. There's more to say about Manu, who threatens the king with revolution if he doesn't behave himself. But there were no revolutions. There were palace coups, oh yes, but there was never an uprising of the people. So these are just ideas which no one really put into action at all until very late. Even Gandhi, after all, had to go to England to get a lot of the stuff he did. It really was very late that revolutionary action came to India.
Okay, another question?
Hello.
I'm Mark Holum.
Hi, Mark.
Hi. In the 14th century, a new group of people enters India, or they entered before, but becomes prominent in India, who provide a very different way of being a Gnostica and criticizing Brahmins, that is Muslims. And I was wondering, and I know this is a hard question, but how, although everything we've been discussing so far has happened before then, how does the 14th century and onward, does the conception of the Charvaka, the Gnostica, get transformed, or does it? I mean, is Islam irrelevant to this?
It's a very good question. I've so far stopped at the 14th century, and one of the things I need to do is bring it up to date, I think. And I also need to ask my Persian reading colleagues what's in those texts. I must ask Muzaffar Alam. That's the first person to check on when I get back to Chicago. The answer is that's a really good question, and I don't know what the answer is. There are some Charvaka texts from later on that seem more of the same, the ones that I've seen so far. I don't think these issues really are part of the Hindu-Muslim dialogue in a way. There were other forms, things that were debated, the authority of the Vedas, of course. But in the terms of the royal people who wrote, we don't know what common or garden people thought among the Muslims in India. But among the royal decrees, there is a lot of respect for Hindu doctrine, and it's treated really at the highest level. I don't know of any text, of any Muslim text that quotes the Charvakas, but then you could put in the black of my eye, as the Irish say, what I know about Muslim ideas about Hinduism.
My question is more on what happens to Hindu texts after this.
Yeah. The ones that I know, if I knew some, I stopped giving you texts because I thought I've been saying this already, I'm saying this already, it's enough. I don't know of any different ones yet, but there are things I don't know yet that I want to look for. I don't know, for instance, if there are Charvakas quoted in the 19th century texts, whether they're picked up by Bengal revolutionaries. I mean, that would be something else. That's another place I need to go. It's a good place to go. I will try to do that, but so far I just haven't gone there.
Okay, we have one more question? Mm-hmm.
My name's Dipan Gupta. I have a question and observation, actually. So first of all, you said this could have been an internal movement, probably was an internal movement within the Brahmins. And when you said that, the first thing that came to mind was a probable suspect might be the Mimamsa scholars, because they were the ones who did a lot of inference stuff, and they were known for arguing with people all the time. And, the Adi Shankara argues with some of them. So what is the importance of that? And the second is, when you talked about the Charvaka ideals, about, all this ritual sacrifices, all evil stuff, stupid, being depicted in a, this is bad fashion. One text that really comes to mind is the Divinity stuff.
Yes.
So there you have a lot of people telling other people and saying this is good. That if you want that other king to fall down, then you should send spies and convince him that he should spend all his money on rituals, so his economy becomes weak, etc. And that's really depicted in a really good light.
That's Arthashastra stuff.
Yeah. This is not just, this is also Divinity. So
Later
some
Arthashastra.
of it, some of it is a bit later. A lot of it is probably around the 14th, 16th centuries as well. So do you think there could have been a separation between sort of kings can behave in other ways as opposed to other people there as well?
Okay, this is good. Those are two separate and good questions. First of all, the Mimamsakas are very important. I just left them out of this talk because I thought enough is enough. But the Mimamsakas are very close to Jayarashi. And a lot of his arguments are either quoting Mimamsakas or arguing against them. The Mimamsakas are a school of Vedic exegesis, which in many ways is Gnostica. It says you don't have to have a god, it's good to sacrifice anyway. So the Mimamsakas are really writing about the sacrifice, but they're not writing about the gods. So in some ways, they're a kind of a stepping, they're halfway to Charvakas. They're a kind of atheistic philosophy. And there really were Mimamsas. No, they're absolutely there. So they're regarded in some ways as Astika school, but they're also Gnostica. So the Mimamsas really are a middle ground of real people, which may in many ways have inspired the Charvakas. The Charvakas may be a subdivision of them and so forth. So insofar they're making, the Mimamsakas are reasonable philosophers, they never go so far as to make the behavioral claims of Brahmins are in it for the money and don't do any sacrifice. They simply have an inferential worldview which denies the necessity for gods. They don't say there aren't any gods. They say you don't need to know if there are any gods. It's irrelevant. So that's really part of the real skeptical school, which I think Jayarashi is part of. I think he is in conversation with Mimamsakas. Some people say he's Mimamsaka, but he differs on several points. But they lack the naughty bits, which is what the Charvakas really become famous for. Kill your father. No Mimamsaka ever says kill your father, right? So it's going so far that makes the Charvakas different. But definitely the Mimamsakas are part of this argument. The other part of your argument is also good. We've seen the non-dharmic, the undharmic, the adharmic attitudes of the Arthashastra in the idea that you can use religion for political purposes in ways which I would say are blasphemous. So the idea that you can get the other king to waste his money on religion is, to my mind, a simple, later Dandaniti. Dandaniti is a later word for Arthashastra, really. It's the science of governing, in a way, part of the Arthashastra. To me, that's just a development out of what Kautilya has already said, but it's an interesting one, and I should look at it. But it's another variant, right, which is religion is just stupid. There's no point in it, but if you get the other king to do it, he'll waste his money. So.
Yeah, but they say this is Raj Dharma. They're also saying that this is your Dharma, which I thought was interesting.
Raj Dharma is to get the other king to do it. It would be real Dharma if they said you should do the sacrifice. But he's not saying you should do it in your quote, right? He's saying get the other guy to do it. He's stupid. So it's an anti-sacrificial statement. Raja Dharma is to get the other king to waste his money on religion. I call that an undharmic statement.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question.
Mm-hmm. Katie, I'm a PhD student in religious studies here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping this isn't too much of a kind of meta question, but I've enjoyed listening to you sort of lay out these lectures through a kind of formal analysis of the structures of these texts. And I'm curious if you could maybe reflect for us on how those sort of structural, formal qualities impact your own laying out of your own arguments, maybe in these lectures, maybe, or broadly speaking, thinking about this lecture in particular about the sort of perpetuation, kind of discursive perpetuation of something in negative. So anyway,
I know what you're getting at. It's good. Okay, so it was halfway through these. Once upon a time, I translated the Laws of Manu, and then after some years, I translated the Kama Sutra. In both cases, because I just felt that the world needed a more accurate translation, that my students needed a more accurate translation. And then I was about to translate the Arthashastra, because those are the three Purusharthas. I thought there was no readable translation of the Arthashastra. And then I discovered that my friend Patrick Olivelle had been on this for years and was going to do a much better job than I would do. So I let him do it, and I decided instead I would write a book about the Arthashastra. So at that point, when I started, so that's how this project began in a way. Let's look at the Arthashastra and the Kama Sutra. But when Patrick was preparing his translation, he sent his draft to me, and I used it in a class I was teaching on the Arthashastra and the Kama Sutra. I used my Kama Sutra and the galley proofs, the page proofs of his new forthcoming translation. And I started noticing in those texts how much violated what Manu said. And I knew Manu very well because I had Manu in my head from translating Manu. I kept saying, oh my God, what Manu would say about this. Oh my God, what Manu would say about this, and so forth. So I started thinking about writing about how they differed from Manu and how that could be. And I found myself getting back to my Oxford DPhil, which I did in 1971 at All Souls with Robin Zahner, R.C. Zahner, on the origins of heresy in Hindu mythology, which eventually expanded to my second book, The Origins of Evil in Hindu Mythology. But the first book, the first DPhil, the second DPhil I'd done in Harvard PhD, but the DPhil also resulted in an article that I published in History of Religions in 1972, before any of you guys were born, the young ones, on the origins of heresy. So I realized it's been a theme of my own work for a long time, looking for these revolutions against the dominant paradigm, the ways that people go against what they're supposed to think of, the rebels in Indian history. And I think that is not irrelevant to my own life and the life of my mother before me, my Trotskyite, anti-Trotskyite, Stalinist mother. So obviously, for a long time, I've been interested in that aspect of religion which is self-critical, which is anti-religious in some ways, how these other texts survive in a culture in which Brahmins control what texts there are. So you should know, we were talking about this before at the press, you should know that given the climate of India and the fact that you can't use vellum to preserve books because it's made of animals, and you have to use vegetable things to write sacred texts on in India, you mainly use palm leaves, which fall apart within at least 100 years, sometimes even earlier, because of the heat and the wet and the monsoon and the red ants and all of that sort of thing. So anytime we have a text in our hand, it means it has been copied at least once a century, let's say twice a century, since it was written, and India has a long tradition. We're talking about 800 BCE. Some of the texts were memorized orally, but after a while they were written down, and these texts had to be preserved by some wealthy person in order to get merit, paying a scribe to recopy the text. So someone wanted this book to keep existing, and that someone, by definition, had to have enough money and enough religious feeling to be part of the dominant paradigm. And yet these texts are so critical of the dominant paradigm. So how is it that kings who want to do the right thing and Brahmins who want to keep people going to the temple and sacrificing and so forth, kept alive these texts that say these terrible things about them? So that was really interesting to me. And I hadn't thought about that when I did the old Oxford DPhil. I just was interested in what they said. But in more recent years, when I've learned from my historian colleagues to be more concerned about the world in which texts live. When I was young, I just read texts. So looking at the world in which texts live, who uses them, why are they preserved, who writes them, who keeps them, and in particular, who is willing to take the time and trouble and money to keep copying them, then it became very paradoxical and surprising to me that we have these texts. Now, we have lots and lots of copies of Manu and lots of other Dharma texts and lots of them. We have very few texts of Artha. We have the Arthashastra and some Dandaniti texts later on. We have the Kama Sutra and just a few after them. So these are minor traditions. And yet the old texts, the Arthashastra and the Kama Sutra, were preserved in several libraries at least. So it was that element of them that I was always interested in, and I think probably because of my personality and the way I was raised, to look at look away from the dominant paradigm, to look at the interstices, to look at the other traditions, the shadow sides of Dharma. So So it's part of the work I've always been doing. So it's a good question. Thank you.
I think on that note, we'll all join in thanking Professor Doniger for some wonderful lectures.
Thank you very much. Great. Good.